During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union created enormous nuclear arsenals. The superpowers threatened each other with total annihilation. But aside from open warfare, there was another threat, that nuclear technology had mushroomed beyond the human capacity to control it, to keep it safe. Both scientists and soldiers learned a painful lesson about the destructive power of their new nuclear arsenals. Accidents happen, often.
All of a sudden, our airplane began to shudder. And then an explosion. I wasn't thinking much about the bombs. I figured the bombs would go down with the airplane.
Until a bomb or warhead is activated for full nuclear detonation, only its conventional, non-nuclear trigger can explode accidentally. At least, that's the theory.
Anytime you're going to lose an airplane with hydrogen bombs or nuclear weapons or whatever on board, you're supposed to let the bombs crash with the airplane. That way, the cleanup will be minimal. They'll know where the bombs are.
A new terminology was needed, a way to describe accidents in which nuclear weapons had been lost or destroyed, or worse. These would be known as broken arrows.
If you're a specialist, you know that broken arrow means serious nuclear weapons accident, with possible radiological contamination and risk of detonation.
Broken arrows occurred during highly classified missions. The accidents tore apart the cloak of nuclear secrecy. And like a recurring nightmare, broken arrows revealed an alarming lack of readiness to cope with a nuclear weapons accident. Now, for the first time, the airmen at the center of the United States' most serious broken arrows come together to tell their stories.
You know, you just can't predict every eventuality. I very nearly lost a B-52 that I was flying because one of the maintenance guys in the hydromatic drives of the engine-driven alternators forgot to screw the caps back on.
These veterans say that understanding the history of nuclear weapons accidents is crucial to global security today, even though the U.S. has reduced its nuclear force from tens of thousands of warheads to the 2,500 kept on alert today.
The 2,500 on alert have a kill capability, destruction capability, something on the order of 50,000 times that of the Hiroshima bomb. The Hiroshima bomb killed 180,000 people. That's where we are today. It's a totally unacceptable risk.
In 1980, the U.S. Defense Department listed 32 broken arrows in the American military during the previous 3 decades. But this is only a partial picture. There had been about 1,200 mishaps with U.S. nuclear weapons, some minor, some serious, potential broken arrows. Some incidents remain secret, and mysteriously, since the 1980 accounting, the Pentagon has had little to say about further accidents.
If you think about the Russian and American nuclear weapons reaching something like 60,000 warheads in total deployed in about 25 different countries around the world, those weapons all have to be moved around, they have to be serviced, they have to be transported, they have to be exercised. And so that's an awful lot of movement of an awful lot of weapons over many years. And I think that explains why we've had so many accidents, because after all, we're dealing with human activity, and as everyone knows, humans ultimately are quite fallible creatures.
In contrast to the painstaking research conducted to build the weapons, the response to a broken arrow was usually improvised. This was disaster control by trial and error, and there was no way to know which part of the system would fail next.
But in a certain sense, that is one of the key problems with complex technology. You only learn how complex technology fails when it fails.
To ensure safe handling of nuclear weapons, missileers and aircrew were carefully trained.
Both pilots and both the navigator and the bombardier attended nuclear weapons school, and we could probably have drawn from memory the fusing and firing diagrams of those weapons.
The men were taught that a nuclear weapon is no more dangerous than a conventional bomb, until a series of steps is taken to connect the explosive trigger to the nuclear core.
People say, well, you know, you were flying around with armed bombs, or when do you arm the bombs? A crew can never arm a bomb. The most a crew can do is pre-arm it. The actual arming takes place through dropping out of the bomb base. Altimeters, as it falls, do other things. Timers, as it falls, do other things. And eventually, at some point prior to reaching where it should detonate, the bomb becomes fully armed. And then, of course, when whatever it is, an altitude or striking the ground, sets it off.
The air crews and missileers of the Cold War had the potential to be the most destructive warriors in history. Most hoped, and many prayed, that their political masters would never try to prove their dominance.
So they have this mutual destruction thing. Everything's gone. There's no choices about we're going to only launch half or a third or 8,215 weapons. Once it's started, everything's going. The biggest idiot in the world could figure out that that's not a good plan. It's not going to happen. And if it does, everybody is gone.
Oh yeah, I realized that when we got back, there probably wouldn't be much there if we got back. I couldn't worry about what was going to happen back home, what was going to be over there. I had a mission to do. It was war. If I went, it was war.
Whatever the situation is, these men respond with all the concentration, seriousness, and confidence the occasion demands.
These were the men assigned to carry, and if necessary to drop, the doomsday bombs. Like generations of warriors before them, they learned it would be impossible to complete their missions without losing or damaging some of their weapons.
They are not supermen. They are just as fallible as any judge, surgeon, or man in government anywhere. In a word, they're human.
The U.S. military's first acknowledged broken arrow occurred in February 1950. A giant six-engine B-36 bomber developed engine trouble on a training flight along the west coast of North America. A fire broke out. To make the aircraft more maneuverable, the pilot jettisoned its payload into the Pacific off the coast of British Columbia. The device was a Mark IV bomb, an updated version of the weapon that had leveled Nagasaki 5 years earlier. Not armed for nuclear detonation, the bomb's conventional explosive blew up above the ocean. The B-36 crashed onto this remote mountainside after its crew bailed out. It took 3 years to find this site, and now, 40 years after the accident, Canadian Forces inspectors return to verify there has been no long-term contamination. There is none, but the Canadians discover artifacts of Cold War nuclear history, spare electronic detonators for the Mark IV bomb. Exactly what happened when U.S. Air Force crews first visited this site remains highly classified. More than safety, secrecy was the top priority.
The danger is that we seem only to learn from the actual accidents and not from the near incidents or the potential accidents or the close calls.
New hazards lay ahead. Freak accidents, coincidences, and chance encounters between man and machine. The U.S. military would discover what might happen to nuclear weapons in a mid-air collision, another broken arrow that would take them completely by surprise. The vast number and complexity of nuclear weapons made preventing accidents next to impossible. The U.S. devised 65 types of warheads. Between 1945 and 1990, a total of more than 70,000 nuclear weapons. The biggest single American bomb built had a destructive force 2,000 times greater than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima.
During the Cold War, we had literally thousands of nuclear weapons on alert on a day-to-day basis. Those would be ICBMs. We had B-52 bombers. We had submarine-launched ballistic missiles.
The power of nuclear weapons was difficult to comprehend, even for the scientists and generals responsible for them. The hydrogen bomb uses nuclear fusion, the same power created by the sun. Potentially, it's an unlimited power.
All matter is held together by very powerful forces. It's why I can tap the arm of this chair and it feels solid. Now, in a nuclear weapon, an explosion is used to break those elements apart, releasing phenomenal amounts of energy, so that something the size of a fuel tank can lay waste to a city.
A nuclear detonation happens in stages. First, a blast of conventional explosive in the weapon is focused against a core of nuclear material, such as uranium. The core is compressed until the nucleus of each atom splits, releasing energy and 2 or more further neutrons. This is fission, the explosive technology of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientists realized that if the extreme heat and energy of a fission explosion could be concentrated on a substance such as hydrogen, the nuclei of the hydrogen atoms would be forced together. This is fusion, a hugely more powerful destructive force.
A fusion bomb uses fission as its trigger and then begins a chain reaction which is virtually limitless. It's limited only by the quantity of fusion material one packs around a weapon.
A 20 megaton hydrogen bomb would explode with a force of 20 million tons of TNT. If these freight cars were loaded with 20 million tons of TNT, the train would be more than 2,000 miles long. If detonated over a major American city, a single thermonuclear bomb would cause at least 2 million deaths and more than 1 million severe injuries. An accidental nuclear detonation, the ultimate broken arrow, would be catastrophic. Yet it was bitter experience, not research or planning, that brought this fact home to the U.S. military. One early aircraft type that navigated this nuclear learning curve was the B-47, the United States' first jet bomber. During training missions, the bombers simulated the dropping of nuclear bombs on mock targets in the U.S. Air Force fighters would simulate defensive attacks on the bombers. Howard Richardson was at the controls of his 3-man B-47 in February 1958.
And about this time, fighters would hit us, and the co-pilot back in the back, he'd get his electronic countermeasures all operating, and he'd get his guns and practice on it with his guns.
My name is Robert Lagerstrom. I was a co-pilot on the B-47 out of Homestead, Florida, the 19th Bomb Wing. And during that time that we were in quote-unquote enemy territory, we were in a situation where we could get fighter passes made upon us, because they also were in a training situation, and they were trying to shoot us down.
The B-47 crew would soon encounter fighter pilot Clarence Stewart.
At that time, we were equipped with F-86, North American F-86Ds, which was a single-place interceptor. Your job was to neutralize any tracks coming into the United States.
The tracks were the flight paths of other aircraft shown on Stewart's electronic monitor, known as NADAR. In this practice run, Stewart's enemy was represented by the B-47 flown by Richardson and Lagerstrom. Trouble was, Richardson and his crew believed they'd completed their mission. They expected no further encounters with fighters. This confusion threatened not just the crew and their aircraft, but its payload too. The B-47 carried a nuclear bomb to make the aircraft handle just as it would in combat.
I had to sign for the nuclear weapon, but I knew exactly what it was. It was a Mark 15 and knew the weight of it. And we figured that in on a weight on takeoff.
Richardson recalls that the bomb was not fitted with its radioactive core or capsule, It was not armed for a complete nuclear detonation.
I didn't sign for the capsule. It was missing.
Despite the pilot's insistence that the bomb was incomplete, controversy still surrounds what happened that night in 1958. As Richardson's bomber neared the end of its mission, he and co-pilot Lagerstrom saw something unusual.
We saw out below us fighter aircraft. They would go underneath us, headed west, and then we saw them turn around and coming back, headed east, and just more or less circling us, you know. We were supposed to have been in friendly territory, and they weren't supposed to be making any attacks on us.
See, we had not been told that. They were still considered a hostile track.
In this communications breakdown, disaster was a split second away. This is the actual nadar tape from Stewart's F-86. The two circles are the converging aircraft. In 1958, pilots didn't have heads-up displays. Stewart's view was downward, into his scope. But the nadar scope was malfunctioning, which Stewart discovered only when he looked up to find the B-47 looming in front of him.
Sky full of airplane. He's there. We're not further down the road. We have already arrived.
Arrived on the tail of Richardson and Lagerstrom's B-47.
And we got this terrific jolt, and because I was facing that way, I saw the explosion of the other aircraft. As it turned out, the other aircraft exploding.
We didn't know what it was. But first we talked about it and we said it's got to be a mid-air collision. What else could it be?
Sheared off the left wing off my airplane. A lot of fire, a lot of fire.
It was just a ball of flame, a big ball of flame. And I mean, his airplane was gone.
First thing we thought about is this our time to go? But you know, all of a sudden our thoughts went back. Man, we had to do something.
In his crumbling aircraft, Stewart had only one thing to do: eject.
Now, that's kind of like leaving the womb. You're pretty warm and safe and feel pretty good, you know, and then all of a sudden you're in a pretty hostile environment.
Richardson and Lagerstrom struggled to keep their bomber flying.
We had what we call tactical doctrine. And we hadn't thought about that weapon at first. We were thinking about the aircraft. Let's evaluate the aircraft.
Tactical doctrine put the safety of the crew first, even ahead of the bomb.
The bomb didn't even enter my mind at all. First and foremost in my mind was, are we going to survive this thing? Are we going to be okay?
At any time, this aircraft could have fallen apart because we didn't know what kind of damage it made. So we got to talking about this weapon. So we figured 7,600 pounds made a lot of difference. So we decided, well, we just better release this weapon.
We knew that there was a lot of high explosive in this weapon. The high explosive, it possibly could go. We could have a pretty big bang if the high explosive in this weapon went.
As we were proceeding out, we got to where we thought was far enough offshore. And I had to call the radar navigator, so I called him. I said, Leland, we're ready to drop it. So he did, and I said, make sure you write the coordinates down.
Their stricken B-47 was lighter by 3 tons. Richardson was able to land.
What did you think when you got onto the ground and took a look at what had happened to you?
Thank you, Lord. The aircraft was pretty torn up.
Clarence Stewart had not been so lucky. Cold and bruised after landing by parachute in the woods, he was mistaken for a poacher and almost shot by a forester. The wreckage of his plane was found miles away. It was probed for clues to the collision. An evaluation board was convened to determine why the two planes had collided. Fighter pilot Stewart came under fire by the bomber's owner, the Strategic Air Command.
And they didn't understand anything about our operation at all and didn't want to learn anything about it. They wasn't interested in it. They were interested in one thing, that was to hang my young ass. And they had pretty well hand-rubbed the gallows and had me hung, pronounced the verdict I was guilty as charged.
Finally, however, the review board was convinced that Stewart's nadar equipment had been faulty. The bomber crew was commended. Richardson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. To this day, the bomb's exact location is a mystery, one of at least 11 U.S. nuclear weapons lost around the world. There have long been suggestions that the bomb off the Savannah coastline might still pose the danger of a nuclear explosion. The pilots insist this isn't true.
We had a bomb that the capability for explosion was high explosive, just sort of like a World War II weapon. And that's the most explosive material that was in that weapon. Out there, right out there.
For the first time since their mid-air collision 42 years ago, bomber pilot and fighter jock finally meet. There's no hard feelings.
No, we don't have any animosity. The co-pilot myself, but we did want to know the reason, you know, what caused it, because we were just left in the dark. We hadn't heard his side of the story, and he filled me in on the reasons.
He was doing his job, not doing my job. It's a big ball game. And you find out, the longer you stay in, how big the ball game really is. Give it your best shot. I'm not gonna kiss him now.
Sack and the people of the Georgia coast emerged unscathed by the Savannah broken arrow. But soon, things would get much more complicated and closer to nuclear disaster. Bikini Atoll in 1954, scene of America's biggest hydrogen bomb detonation. Supposedly a controlled test, the blast revealed to U.S. officials how nuclear weapons accidents could unfold right before their eyes. Some scientists feared the chain reaction might never stop. 100 American sailors on one ship were showered with radioactive fallout. The people of nearby islands suffered greater exposure.
229 natives and 28 American service personnel received doses ranging from 12 to 200 Roentgens. None of the doses appeared to reach levels of immediate combat significance, nor did the people suffer severe effects.
There was profound misunderstanding and misinformation during the Cold War about atomic hazards and accidents.
Well, Bert, you were out there. How's about some comments on this radiation I hear so much about?
Well, there is radiation. There's no question about that. But, well, for example, the other day I was out there at 2,500 yards from ground zero, and I received 1 milliroentgen of radiation during that time. And it takes approximately 450 Roentgens to place one in the critical category. So, as you can see, I'm still here.
All right. These bombers get off first.
A new language was developed by the military to conceal the alarming facts of unlimited warfare from the public.
Certainly, there is a whole vernacular around nuclear weapons, which really only makes sense to specialists. MAD is a good example.
Mutually assured destruction.
NUTS is another example.
Nuclear utilization, target selection.
Broken arrow, bent spear, dull sword, faded giant, and so on. This was extremely politically sensitive, and therefore the terminology reflects a certain desire to shield the public from what was actually happening.
Tony knows the bomb can explode any time of the year, day or night. He is ready for it. Duck and cover. Atta boy, Tony. That flash means act fast.
When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
The public were not alone in their ignorance of nuclear weapons. Even the top man in the Department of Defense could find himself mystified by the bomb.
When I became secretary, I'd been president of Ford Motor Company. I didn't know the difference between a nuclear bomb and a conventional bomb. A nuclear bomb must be bigger, larger, more destructive. I didn't understand it.
To learn more about his new arsenal, McNamara went to the Omaha headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. There, General Curtis LeMay, SAC's hardline anti-Soviet commander, gave him a preview of World War III.
And I asked him to go through the very, very secret plans. Almost no civilian had ever heard them. I was absolutely shocked because the NATO strategy at that time and the U.S. strategy and General LeMay's and the Strategic Command's war plans contemplated first use of nuclear weapons by the United States in the event of a Warsaw Pact conventional force attack on NATO territory.
LeMay's hawkish deployment of nuclear weapons posed huge safety problems. Warheads could be lost, stolen, or damaged anywhere around the globe. And worse, a U.S. broken arrow might prompt a Soviet counterattack. McNamara sought a more flexible policy.
When I came back, I recommended to President Kennedy in a very, very confidential session with him, one-on-one, that he should never, under any circumstances, follow NATO strategy and U.S. war plans in the event of a Soviet Warsaw Pact attack on Western Europe, even if the Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces were extending all across Germany and actually on the verge of taking the capital, Bonn. I think he accepted.
But General LeMay wasn't easily restrained. As a young major general in 1945, he had escalated the bombing in the war in the Pacific. 5 years later, as chief of SAC and countering the Soviets, LeMay declared there must be no boundaries to our air development. But the Air Force soon discovered the downside of LeMay's aggressive posture. In 1958 at Lakeen Heath Air Base in England, a U.S. bomber crash-landed.
And crashed, unfortunately, into a storage igloo, which is like a semi-buried, hardened shelter for the storage of nuclear weapons. Now, two unfortunate things happened at Lakeen Heath. First of all, the aircraft smashed the roof of the igloo off, so laying bare the nuclear weapons. Famously, it was described as looking like a nest of eggs. The second thing that happened was that the fuel that was pouring out of the aircraft engulfed the weapons, and so one had a potentially very dangerous circumstance.
A news blackout was dropped on Lakeen Heath. Denial had become the military's reflex response to broken arrows. This secrecy fueled suspicion of a greater catastrophe.
I think the lessons learned were, above anything else, don't put your storage igloos so close to the runways. Of course, the accident taught the technical community a great deal about what needed to be done to protect nuclear weapons from fire hazard and from impact hazard.
SAC's early broken arrows did not tame General LeMay. He took even greater risks, including Project Control, intentional overflights of Soviet territory by U.S. planes. This was baiting the bear, trying to provoke the Soviets.
Curtis LeMay once commented that the Soviet Union would be a smoking, radiating ruin after a U.S. nuclear attack. And that's absolutely right. Flip side, if you need to have some possibility of nuclear retaliation for the sake of deterrence, you also have to have at least some risk of those weapons being used inappropriately by accident.
It wasn't long before LeMay's policies went beyond the limits of safety, and at the worst possible time, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
In August 1962, one of the B-52s that we had on an airborne alert was supposed to go past Thule, Greenland, hug the Canadian coast, and then turn south when it got to Alaska to go back to the United States. It took a wrong radar bearing and strayed thousands of miles off course and entered into the Soviet Union's air defense net when it finally discovered where it was and rapidly turned back to the United States.
The Soviets could have concluded they were under attack. Worse, LeMay and SAC did not learn from the accident. U.S. airborne alert routes remained unchanged for another 2 months, until the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of all-out nuclear war. In 1962, secret Soviet nuclear missile sites were set up on the island of Cuba, putting U.S. cities within easy range of Russian warheads. President John F. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the weapons. Robert McNamara was at Kennedy's side throughout the crisis. Today, he believes that America's policies were partly to blame.
The conclusion we came to is that probably Khrushchev was most influenced in putting the nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba by his fear that we, the U.S., would invade Cuba with U.S. military forces and overthrow Castro. But also, very clearly, he was motivated by the fact that we had surrounded him, in a sense, with our nuclear weapons.
As Soviet ships carried warheads towards Cuba, the U.S. assembled a huge invasion force on the island's doorstep. Many generals and advisors in the Kennedy administration urged the president to attack if the Soviets refused to remove their nuclear threat. Meantime, SAC quadrupled the number of planes flying around the Soviet Union. 1/3 of its nuclear bomber force, 500 planes, went to 15-minute alert. 7,000 megatons of nuclear weapons were readied, the explosive force of 5,000 Hiroshimas. Finally, the Soviets withdrew their Cuban arsenal. But one potentially fatal flaw in American intelligence could have caused the U.S. to stumble into a nuclear holocaust.
The CIA said the warheads for those launchers had not yet arrived in Cuba. They thought 20 were on a ship named the Poltava coming there. We learned 30 years later, there were 162 nuclear warheads there, 90 tactical warheads to be used against an invasion force, and 60 or 70 to be used on the intermediate range missiles, which, had they been launched, would have killed 80 million Americans. Now, we came that close to attacking. God knows I would have opposed it. I am certain Kennedy would have opposed it. But how long would it have been deferred? I don't know. That was how close we came to total disaster. And when I say we, I mean not just the U.S., the world.
The crisis had revealed for the U.S. president and his men much more than the treachery of their Soviet adversary. They had also seen the true scope of their own Strategic Air Command's Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan. It was based on the total nuclear annihilation of the enemy. Kennedy wanted a more graduated strategy, in part to allow for accidents, which appeared inevitable.
There's a phrase, fog of war. It's a very, very important phrase. What it means is that military operations are so complex, it is impossible for the human mind to encompass all of the alternatives, all of the risks. There is no military utility to nuclear weapons other than to deter one's opponent from their use.
Curtis LeMay retired in 1964, but Cold War tensions and broken arrows continued during McNamara's term as Defense Secretary under Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson. On December 8, 1964, an aircraft transporting nuclear weapons crashed at an Air Force base in Indiana. The president took a call that afternoon from his defense secretary.
Now, what happened to her plane yesterday? So far, very little public knowledge of it, and nothing other than the aircraft burned. There were 3 crew members, 2 escaped with minor injuries. The navigator ejected from the aircraft and was killed. The weapons were destroyed, and representatives of the appropriate government safety agencies are on the scene now, and they detect no radiation. Does it land in there something? No, it was taxiing on the runway at the time. When this explosion? Yes, as I understand it, the gear collapsed, and the landing gear collapsed, and the collapse of the landing gear caused seams in the fuel tanks to break open, and fire started, and the aircraft began to burn, and the weapons burned.
The damage and adverse publicity had been contained, but Johnson and McNamara and the U.S. military were soon to face 2 of the most embarrassing broken arrows of them all. Once again, the Cold War would be revealed to be not just balance of terror, but trial and error. The U.S. military scrambled to find ways of ensuring maximum safety for its nuclear arsenal. But safety was often at odds with the widespread deployment and increased readiness of the weapons. And preventing every possible broken arrow would be expensive.
I suppose that one has to see here a cost-benefit tension. The cost of preparing on an almost global scale, because of the deployment of American nuclear weapons, for a maximal response to a potential nuclear weapons accident was simply prohibitive.
Often, the U.S. military did the best it could afford, even if the best wasn't necessarily the safest.
When the W-88 warhead was decided upon, it was a conscious decision to have a less safe conventional explosive put around the warhead so that we could have increased range for the sake of deterrence.
Nowhere did the conflicting goals of offense and safety clash more frequently than with the B-52. It was the vanguard of the more than 4,600 nuclear-capable bombers built by the U.S.
The B-52 was a magnificent machine. You're flying something that's all business, and you had to have your mindset towards that. There are no practical jokes going on. You're going to war.
Wendorf would not go down in history as just any B-52 pilot. His aircraft would be the focus of one of America's most alarming broken arrows. The first B-52s in service had a design flaw, one that would propel Jim Wendorf and his crew into a mid-air disaster.
Early on, they had some problems with the tail structures, and the tails broke off for a variety of reasons. They fixed that. Well, as a matter of fact, they fixed it after our accident.
January 16th, 1966 began as a day off for Wendorf and his family.
It was a Sunday, and we were taking off around 6 o'clock in the evening, as I recall. I'd gone to church earlier that day with my family, and on the way home, my wife said, "Honey, I just wish you didn't have to do this flight tonight."
Wendorf's aircraft carried 4 B-28 nuclear bombs, upwards of 300 times the explosive force of the Hiroshima bomb. With this payload, he and his crew flew across the Atlantic and far beyond.
As part of our airborne alert operation during the 1960s, we kept B-52 bombers on a route moving through the Mediterranean and then circling over the Mediterranean so they could attack, if necessary, the Soviet Union from its softer underbelly.
The planes needed 2 mid-air refuelings. Things went well until the second, over Spain.
We were about 31,000 feet, as I recall. We joined up with the tanker. As we made the rendezvous, I could see the entire tanker in front of us. All of a sudden, our airplane began to shudder. And then an explosion. And fire and debris shot up from aft part of the cockpit area. Next thing I know, everything's black. I knocked myself out. What I think happened was the tail broke off because of a structural failure. A tail on a B-52 has no lifting component on it. It's all a download because of the swept wing configuration. So if you lose the tail, the airplane is going to lose a lot of weight and drag. So what do you think would happen? It would flip up and come around. And I think that's what happened.
The tanker plummeted earthward, exploding in a fireball over the coast of southeast Spain. Its 3-man crew was killed. 3 crewmen on the stricken B-52 would die as well. But Jim Wendorf and 4 others managed to bail out.
And I was like tumbling, and I could hear noises. It was hot. Then all of a sudden, whap, I'm wide awake. My feet headed towards the water. I looked to the ground, and I could see that I was being blown out over the water. I counted some other chutes. I saw a big explosion hit the ground. I saw the tail of our airplane hit the ground.
Far below, fishing captain Simon Paco Orts had seen everything from the deck of his boat.
Yes. When the planes exploded, I saw it clearly. Right from the explosion. Many parachutes fell. the 4 airmen, and a case, also with a parachute. This one fell near me and my boat, on the left.
The object Paco saw was one of the B-52's bombs descending on its parachute, designed to slow descent and delay a nuclear blast until the bomber clears the area. The bomb disappeared beneath the waves. So too had Jim Wendorf.
Next thing I knew, I was about 15 feet underwater, looking up with my parachute over the top, and you could see the risers and the chute. And I kind of laughed to myself, hey, you made it, but you're too far down in the water. What are you going to do? Well, I swam to the surface.
I called to the other boats, and we located all the airmen. A friend of mine went to get the 2 pilots.
Now I'm on this fishing boat, everybody jabbering in what I thought was Spanish. I wasn't thinking much about the bombs. I was more interested in counting survival chutes of the guys. I figured the bombs would go down with the airplane.
They had, but individually. The B-52's bomb rack had been ripped apart. 3 of the bombs fell at Palomares, a farming village. 1 landed gently in its parachute with little damage, but 2 hit hard enough to detonate their conventional explosive. The bomb's plutonium core material was scattered by the blast, but they had not been activated for nuclear detonation.
I had full confidence that we would not have a nuclear explosion. There's too many things that have to happen before you're going to get an explosion. You've got to do things to the weapon itself to get it into that configuration. Those things had not happened.
What had happened, however, was unprecedented. 4 sophisticated radioactive weapons had rained down on the quaint landscape of southern Spain. Farming and fishing villages that had no telephones, that electricity had reached only 7 years earlier, now had been pushed to center stage of the Cold War. Juan Jose Celdran, the current mayor of Palomares, recalls what happened next.
After one bomb fell here and the others close by, right away the American army came to cordon off the area to see what repercussions had been caused, to check the state of the bombs, and to handle the consequences for the people here and their crops. It was a miracle that there were no other casualties in or near Palomares, that farmers were not hit by anything, considering all the pieces that fell. All the farmers stood close together to each other, surprised and not believing what had happened.
U.S. and Spanish officials realized there would have to be a massive cleanup. Debris from the plutonium cores had drifted miles across the fields. But there was another, even more urgent priority, and Paco Wirtz was the only man who could help them.
Today they have radars and sonars, but before it came down to us, the fishermen. No one knew exactly where the bomb fell except Paco. Only I knew. We can pick points of reference, usually 1, but I had chosen 3 to know the place. Without complimenting myself, I was the one who knew best.
Paco became indispensable to U.S. Air Force officers and nuclear weapons specialists. They took him to sea so that he could locate precisely the bomb's last known position on the surface. Meantime, something else was descending on Palomares: the press.
My life became very complicated. The reporters came and came for months, and the place was filled with reporters, and they all wanted exclusivity. And I told them, what for? I did not want to tell them anything.
Since he was on a classified mission, Jim Wendorf could duck the press, but not his superiors.
There was a full colonel sitting right next to me, asking question after question. I was not answering any of it, didn't want to answer any of it, didn't feel good. I said, sir, would you leave me alone? Just leave me alone, I don't feel good. Well, he started on his questions again. I had to barf. I chose the most appropriate place, I thought, all over him. He did not ask me any more questions.
But questions and controversy would hang over Palomares for months and years to follow. Would there be health risks from radioactive contamination? Would the Soviet Union win a battle in the Cold War by shaming the U.S. Air Force over the accident? And most of all, exactly where was the missing nuclear bomb, and how could it be recovered? A U.S. Air Force accident board was set up the day after the mid-air collision over Palomares, Spain. A base camp swiftly took shape on the beach. Tents and earth-moving equipment were flown in from bases in Spain, Tunisia, and the United States. 700 American airmen, soldiers, and sailors would take part in the cleanup and the search for the missing bomb. Total price tag? $80 million, the most expensive broken arrow to that time.
We have to be quite impressed by the response on one level, by which I mean that the American government took the accident extremely seriously, and perhaps they didn't have a choice to do that. They moved a lot of men and material in quite quickly. They made huge efforts at great expense, I have to say, to clear up the area within their own parameters. Doesn't mean that those parameters were necessarily correct.
The people of Palomares were the first civilian population exposed to a plutonium accident. The radioactive cores of 2 bombs had been dispersed over their fields and homes. Much more dangerous than nuclear power fuel, it posed extreme dangers, hazards not completely understood at the time. American servicemen used rudimentary detectors. They had no established guidelines to follow.
When the American Army first found the bombs, they did not know either what were the minimum or maximum levels of radiation or the extent of the radioactivity that was tolerable for human health, for the sea, and so on. The soldiers ate tomatoes and other produce. They obviously didn't realize the gravity of the consequences and possible repercussions of the radioactivity level. The farmers were happy to welcome them, and they shared meals with the locals, eating a bit of everything.
Some local residents, however, came to resent the U.S. military.
The Americans couldn't have done less at the time for the people of Palomares. Our fish from the waters offshore and the tomatoes from the land, no one wanted them.
The Soviet Union denounced the Americans. In their Cold War rivalry, this was a propaganda coup that Moscow was eager to exploit. The most extreme Russian claim was that the U.S. intentionally dropped the bombs to provoke World War III. At the very least, the Kremlin charged, Palomares was a violation of the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Pressure mounted on the Johnson administration and the Pentagon. But the U.S. military's neither confirm nor deny policy on nuclear weapons only made it harder to come up with credible explanations. Meanwhile, within SAC, Palomares was ultimately accepted as an accident. The cause? Structural failure of Jim Wendorf's B-52.
The bomb never had any effect on me or anything that happened on the ground there. I figured no one else was hurt. It caused a lot of trouble economically for the farmers down there. Kind of ruined their harvest season, I guess. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't do anything about that.
The exhaustive search of the seafloor for the missing bomb dragged on, week after week. The U.S. Navy submersibles Illuminaut and Alvin were found to be severely limited at the plus 2,000-foot depths of the search zone. Finally, on the 15th of March, nearly 2 months after the accident, the Alvin located the B-28 bomb, still wrapped in its parachute, at a depth of 2,500 feet. It had sunk to the bottom, then skidded along the mud, creating a 400-foot trail that guided electronic scanners to its position.
So they started to drag it up, and the cable broke, and they lost it again for a few days. And I'm being told by several people, hey, this thing is costing our government millions and millions of dollars. Well, there wasn't much I could do about it. They're going to recover the doggone thing. And if they got the money, then go get it.
The rogue bomb, shifted by currents, continued to frustrate the Navy. Finally, a cable-controlled submersible managed to attach lines to the weapon. It was hoisted aboard the USS Petrel on the morning of April 7, 1966, 80 days after the accident. The Air Force announced that the casing was intact, Still, a render-safe procedure was performed at sea to fully separate triggering devices from the conventional explosives and plutonium core. At last, the threat posed by this nuclear weapon had been removed. The Johnson administration, with its prestige at stake at Palomares, decided to show off an American H-bomb for the first time. However reluctantly, a superpower had acknowledged the public's need to know about nuclear weapons. Today, the sun-drenched coast of southeast Spain is far removed from global power struggles. A building boom has advanced up the shoreline towards Palomares. This luxury complex of hotels and apartments will sprawl across the beach. Spanish officials say the only radiation hazard is from the sun. That advice should be reassuring to visitors and residents here. The site of one of America's worst broken arrows will soon be a mecca for nudists. There are no markers, much less museums, to the accident in 1966. Palomares wants to move on.
Por supuesto, una consecuencia mala.
Clearly, we suffered some bad consequences because of all the sensationalism at the time. But we're normal people, not Martians, contrary to what some people make us seem. I don't think anything positive came from having 3 bombs fall on a village. We hope that this incident will remain only an anecdote in the history of Palomares. There are many other things here that have much more meaning to us. We don't want to be stigmatized by the bombs.
Still today, nearly 4 decades after the accident, Spanish authorities monitor the area and its people for after effects of the radioactive contamination. Though there's been no marked increase in health problems, scientists say the broken arrow left an indelible mark.
In a case like Palomares, for example, the evidence is overwhelming that there is still an above-normal persistence of radioactive material in the soil in that part of southern Spain some 34 years after the accident. They still think Palomares represented a major raising of the public profile of nuclear weapons accidents, because here was something that couldn't be covered up, it couldn't be accounted for.
When completed, the scope of the cleanup was staggering. The contaminated soil and vegetation filled 5,500 storage barrels. The fields, fruit, and vegetables of Palomares were shipped around the world to the United States and buried at the Savannah River nuclear power plant in Georgia. Although the U.S. spent $80 million cleaning up the area and recovering the lost bomb, only $700,000 in compensation was paid to local residents. Looking back, says Paco Orts, that was not enough.
What I did was for Spain. I wasn't doing a favor for the United States. They lost a bomb. What was it? $6 million. But we had great fear. And what would have happened if the bomb had detonated? The Mediterranean here would be a Dead Sea. Yes, the Americans said the bomb was to counter the Red threat. But I thought the Americans had more than words. I think that we should give more food to those in need around the world, and particularly to the little ones who die of hunger, and leave all these bombs and malice.
Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. The bigger picture for the United States and for the NATO alliance was the defense of Western Europe, the defense of the free world against the Soviet threat. And therefore, even an accident like Palomares was never going to lead to a road to Damascus, transfer of thinking about nuclear weapons. The future of nuclear weapons was not put in doubt by Palomares. But certainly, Palomares brought them up very abruptly against the limits of what they were able to guarantee in terms of nuclear weapons safety and security.
Regardless of the lessons learned, the deployment of war-ready nuclear weapons by the Strategic Air Command would continue until more broken arrows brought these missions permanently down to earth. Unexpected failures of technology have caused most nuclear weapons accidents. But the human factor has had the potential for the most dangerous broken arrows. What if the unthinkable happened? What if servicemen handling nuclear weapons tried to steal them, or worse, detonate them? The U.S. military realized a radical new safety program was needed.
Because of an incident that occurred in the late 1950s where an Air Force sentry put a nuclear weapon under severe risk. This officer became despondent, wanted to commit suicide, and held his gun to the head of a nuclear warhead, threatening to shoot it off.
Fortunately, the officer surrendered without firing a shot. But once again, a very predictable potential hazard had been revealed only by bitter experience. Many human beings cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons.
All sorts of accidents, all sorts of safety and security problems in particular were arising because of the way in which people were behaving. They were behaving irrationally, they were behaving unstably, some were going nuts, for want of a better word.
To identify and remove unstable nuclear weapons handlers, the U.S. military devised the Personnel Reliability Program.
Who's guarding the guardians? It's a severe problem. You've got to make sure that the individuals involved in maintaining nuclear weapons, in guarding them, in taking them apart, in loading them onto delivery vehicles, all highly reliable individuals.
Stress was found to be the main factor undermining reliability. Stress caused by personal problems, frustration, and most of all, boredom. Underground missile control room crews were especially at risk. Their shifts meant long hours repeating routine tasks. For some, it was literally mind-bending.
Now, the figures that are in the public domain are actually quite alarming, because they show that of something like 100,000 personnel involved in the management and operations of nuclear weapons during the, let us say, the 80s as an example, something like 5,000 per year, about 5%, were removed by the PRP program. They were screened out. In other words, if you failed PRP criteria, then you were removed.
The problem was that until they were detected, neurotic, even psychotic personnel had been handling nuclear weapons in the previous year. In some cases, only the two-person rule had ensured basic safety, the requirement that every movement of a nuclear warhead must involve at least two persons.
The idea being, of course, therefore, that if some individual went mad, the other person would be there to check them.
Even the President of the United States comes under the two-person rule. His decision whether or not to use nuclear weapons would be taken with his defense chiefs. But over time, in the sometimes tense, often boring isolation of standby for nuclear war, human ingenuity has played havoc with even the most basic safety system.
The separation of the two keys for missile launch was intended to stop one person from launching a weapon on his or her own. But during a routine discussion, when some press came to a Minuteman silo to talk to the missileers, one of them, in an aside to a journalist, said that the whole thing about the dual keys was a nonsense, because he had discovered that he could do both himself using a piece of string and a spoon. And that's a very good example of negative ingenuity, using human ingenuity to overcome a safety system.
But the key problem with human ingenuity has been its shortcomings, the inability of weapons handlers to cope with equipment failure, tragic coincidence, and just plain bad luck. January 1968, the last year of the Johnson administration. The war in Vietnam rages into a new lethal phase. And the world continues to shiver in the grip of the Cold War. For the crewmen of the Strategic Air Command, it's another year of preparing for nuclear war against the Soviet Union. In Operation Chromedome, SAC kept some U.S. bombers constantly airborne, ready to strike.
Nuclear weapons in the skies 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
January 17, 1968, Plattsburgh Air Base in upstate New York. John Haug, a top B-52 pilot, sets off on a war-ready mission to the aerial frontier of the Soviet Union.
It was just another flight. It was basically, as I look at it, it was probably a show of strength to Russia. But to the flight crew, it was just another 24-hour training mission. I never once thought that, that this training mission was going to wind up going to war. But then I never once realized that this training mission was going to wind up as a B-52 crash either.
The flight would be over Thule, Greenland, where the U.S. maintained an airbase on Danish territory. The flight was bumpy even before it left the ground, a feeling shared by Haug's co-pilot.
My name is Alfred DeMario. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. In the last 30 to 45 minutes before takeoff, all of a sudden there was a mad scramble to move all the food and various things that we had from this one airplane to the other airplane.
We went out and we found out that the primary airplane couldn't go, the secondary airplane couldn't go, and the airplane that had landed the day before had 7 major write-ups on it, which were all ground-checked okay, and it was ready for flight. They said, well, everything's checked out okay, so we assumed that the airplane was really functional and ready to go.
After takeoff, however, Haug encountered nagging problems.
Once we got leveled off and tried to engage the autopilot, we found that the airplane was porpoising slightly. In other words, servos that run the pitch control of the airplane were moving back and forth, causing the airplane to oscillate just a little bit.
The problem wasn't serious enough to scrub the mission, but it signaled the start of a very bad day.
I was upset because they really hadn't fixed it. They had to put an airplane into the sky that day.
Then the sequence of things that started the whole thing going downhill began.
The real trouble occurred after we got to Thule. And just as we were arriving at Thule, the airplane was getting very cold.
They just don't supply enough heat to keep it warm. I mean, you're flying at minus 55 degrees centigrade, and it's cold, really cold.
They have 2 air conditioning systems on board the B-52. They have a primary, which goes to a rheostat, and you can control the temperature inside. The alternate comes right off one of the engines, directly hot air into the cockpit.
So initially, you start turning up the heat control in the normal air conditioning system. Eventually, you reach the top. You just hit max, and it's still getting colder. Okay, at that point, you switch to the alternate heat and pressurization system.
But we were monitoring it well below that when we were in there. And it only took less than 15 minutes for it to start a fire down in the navigator's compartment, down in the lower compartment of the B-52.
One of the crewmen had blocked a heating vent.
Those vents were not identified at all. They weren't like color-coded, no signs saying caution, extremely hot, nothing. But somebody came over interphone and said they thought they smelled smoke.
And I told the navigator to fight the fire. He put it out, the fire reoccurred. He put it out, the fire reoccurred.
And you would think, well, you ought to be able to put out a cushion with a fire extinguisher, but these cushions were still being air blasted by this hot air. So it was like trying to put out a blowtorch.
The crew prayed for a break. One came, but it was a bad one. A complete failure of the B-52's electrical system.
The minute we lost electrical power, I knew emergency landing was impossible because we couldn't put the flaps down. The airplane weighed too much. If we tried to make a no-flap landing, we couldn't have stopped it on the runway. We'd have gone off the end of the runway. So I basically told the crew at that point that I'll try to get the airplane over Thule and we'll bail out over Thule.
The crew's training meant that their aircraft's 4 thermonuclear bombs had to stay exactly where they were.
Anytime you're going to lose an airplane with hydrogen bombs or nuclear weapons or whatever on board, you're supposed to let the bombs crash with the airplane. That way, the cleanup will be minimal. They'll know where the bombs are. It won't be like over in Spain when they spent 6 months, I guess, trying to find that one bomb that fell out.
So because the bombs had not been armed,
right,
there was nothing to be concerned about?
Nothing to be concerned about. The safety of the crew was the only concern I had at that time. The bombs would take care of themselves.
The crew members prepared to eject into the Arctic night.
I think it was the gunner that asked me, "Are we over Thule yet?" And I leaned up in my seat and I couldn't see the white lights anymore, and I said, "Well, I think we're about there." And then I gave the order to bail out.
Haug and DeMario armed their seats.
When you rotate the arming lever, it blows a hatch, it arms the seat, and then there's a trigger, and you squeeze the trigger and it fires a cannon shell that shoots you out of the airplane. You're riding the seat, which is the top of the cannonball.
My visor had been giving me trouble anyway, so I decided that instead of taking a chance on having it pushed back into my face, I would just lock it in the up position and bail out without the visor. So I did, and ended up with 2 black eyes because, unknown to us, our speed was somewhere close to 600 miles an hour. And I ejected straight up into a 600-mile-an-hour wind right in the face.
Once I cleared the airplane, I was knocked unconscious. I lost my helmet and left me with a scar on the bridge of my nose.
And I'm coming down very smoothly in the parachute. Then what looked like 8 to 10 miles away off to my left, there was a tremendous explosion, light, and that obviously was the airplane crashing.
The parachute started oscillating kind of violently, and it woke me up. And it was still oscillating a little bit, and I figured, well, that must have been the shock wave from the airplane crashing. And just as I was about to touch down, I reached up on my parachute and pulled down just as I touched, and had a very soft landing on some snow.
At first I thought I was going to land in snow, and I thought that would be great, it would be soft. Well, it wasn't snow, it was ice, hard ice. I hit like a ton of bricks.
The last member of the crew, the co-pilot, was killed during the ejection. In other words, the airplane was going too fast at the time of ejection. He had to go down through the fire. The fire weakened his harness, and when he bailed out and the parachute apparently opened, the harness was weakened to the point where it failed, or even the parachute failed, and he was killed.
Haug had flown the plane directly over the U.S. Air Base at Thule. Remarkably, he and his crew landed on Air Force property.
The first person I actually met in base operations was a man whose name I can't remember, but I had been stationed with him earlier, I think at Loring Air Force Base. And I made a really stupid comment like, "I didn't expect to drop in on you this way."
6 of the 7-man crew had survived. But now, as at Palomares, the questions would begin. And the questions would begin and continue to this day with the fate of the aircraft's nuclear bombs. Had they all been destroyed? And what was the truth about the hazards left behind? Thule, Greenland, January 1968. A U.S. B-52 with 4 nuclear bombs on board had crashed in flames onto the sea ice. For John Haug, Alfred DeMario, and the other surviving crewmen, a grueling new phase of their flying careers had just begun.
The world's press corps had descended on Thule, Greenland, because this was a big deal.
Well, right away they wanted to keep it hushed up because they were afraid it was going to affect the Danish elections, and the Danes control Greenland.
Well, first of all, we didn't want to talk to the press, and secondly, we were told we could not talk to the press. This back in the days when, by regulation, you could not admit either the presence or absence of nuclear weapons on a base or in an airplane or anything like that.
I had no concern with the airplane. In other words, the airplane crashed and gone in. I knew that they were going to have to clean up the mess, but that didn't bother me a bit. What I was more interested in was that the story got told, the problems we had, what went on, why things didn't work.
The crew were confident they'd done the right thing with their nuclear payload.
Had we dropped them individually, it's real possible, assuming, let's say, that we were over ice, it's possible that the bombs then could have gone through the ice and be laying on the bottom. This way, they were with the airplane.
The B-52 had descended in a broad arc and was now little more than a slash of charred debris on the ice. The conventional explosive in the bombs had blown up with the jet's fuel, dispersing the plutonium core material.
They sent out some Eskimos to check out the site. In other words, they thought we'd gone in with the airplane, so they'd sent these Eskimos out right away. And they had on these great big, beautiful sealskin Eskimo parkas, and when they came back, they were a little bit radioactive, so they had to buy all these parkas off of these Eskimos and decontaminate them, I guess.
The largest piece of the airplane that I was told that was found was about the size of the lid off of a cooler chest.
But in the storm of publicity that followed the crash, questions arose. Had one of the bombs survived the crash and fallen through the ice?
Absolutely a falsehood. There is no way that the bombs, any bomb, could have survived the crash. And there's no way that the bomb left the airplane before it crashed.
To verify that theory, and because radioactive debris covered the ice at the crash scene, the Johnson administration ordered a cleanup and an intensive search.
And in the case of Thule, in contrast to Palomares, we have much better public domain evidence about the consequences of that radiological hazard.
Danish workers joined U.S. military personnel in gathering up debris and in the exhaustive shoveling up of radioactive ice and snow. As at Palomares, all the material was to be shipped back to the United States. Ice and snow from Greenland, buried in Texas.
I followed up a study in 1986 which traced 800 of the Danish personnel who were involved in that clear-up. And of those 800, something like 500 were found to have chronic illnesses of one sort or another, and 90 of the 800 actually had cancer or had died of cancer. Clearly, that tells us two things. It tells us that the extent of the radiological hazard was great. It tells us also that the men that were sent in to do the clear-up were not adequately protected against the consequences of that contamination.
I thought, well, okay, we'll go out with a couple plows and snow shovels and clean things up a little bit. It just never dawned on me until much, much later when it was all over and I got to read what the entire operation was about, that I realized the full scope of this thing.
As well as the cleanup, the Pentagon had a second priority, proving none of the bombs had gone missing. The search was hampered by the severe weather. It wasn't known how much of the aircraft had burned through the ice cap and now rested on the sea floor. It was 6 months later, during the summer ice breakup, that a research sub called Star 3 finally carried nuclear safety expert Weston Rowe to the crash site.
I think it was, in my opinion, was to satisfy the Danes that there was nothing there that would contaminate the ecology or be harmful to them. Certainly the question had to be answered, is there a weapon lying down there? It's my understanding from reading the accident reports that component parts of 3 weapons were identified, but not of 4. So, okay, you could conceivably have a weapon down there.
Determining whether the 4th bomb lay whole or in pieces on the seabed led to long days of scanning the debris field. This is the first time these previously classified images from the Star 3 search have been telecast.
Did you have Geiger counters or radiation detectors?
No.
Nothing that sophisticated at that time?
No, there was no monitoring for radiation.
Did you see anything?
Aircraft parts.
Any bomb components?
No.
A bomb itself?
No.
So your conclusion, the 4th weapon?
It was on the surface someplace. Consumed, maybe, by the fire.
Most military analysts agree that it's unlikely a nuclear bomb went astray at Thule. Still, in terms of long-term threat to personnel at the scene, the accident was arguably the most harmful broken arrow ever.
It seems clear to me that America's culpability for the accident is undeniable. it seems to me also that the conditions under which the Danish personnel in particular worked in and around Thule during the accident cleanup clearly were inadequate. They were not properly protected, they were not properly apprised of the possible radiological hazard. I think it's also widely accepted now that the levels of radioactive contamination that were considered acceptable at that time were too high. And I think also the systems that were in place then to detect radiological hazard also were faulty, by which I mean that the typical way in which the radiological hazard was detected was by badges which changed color as a consequence of reaching a minimum level of radiological contamination. Now, what those badges never told anyone was actually how high above that minimum level the radiological contamination actually was. It could have been 1 degree above, or it could have been 10 times, 100 times the acceptable upper limit.
The broken arrow at Thule, Greenland, signaled the end of Operation Chromedome, SAC's shotgun in the sky deployment of war-ready nuclear weapons. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara recommended the bombs be kept on the ground. President Johnson agreed. Just days after the accident, Chromedome passed into history.
It was too risky, and it wasn't necessary. We had missiles that could not be destroyed in submarines or other hard silos or whatever. In any event, we stopped the missions because they were too risky.
I would analyze it simply as the American government waking up to a faulty balance, not getting the safety versus the readiness issue right. And whatever the advantages were of having B-52s in permanent airborne patrol, they were outweighed by the political consequences and the human consequences of these common accidents.
Our activity that day was as much a contribution to the successful conduct of the Cold War as if we had not crashed. As a result, Europe wasn't reduced to ashes because we were able to prevent a hot war by conducting the Cold War. This was one of the casualties of the Cold War. And I think people who may have suffered injuries as a result of that crash were, again, victims of the Cold War. And that's not nearly as many victims as there would have been had that war turned hot.
Despite safer deployments, there would be many more accidents with nuclear weapons. Some 1,200 mishaps, including more than 30 broken arrows, were recorded up to 1980. Mysteriously, there's been no official count from the U.S. government since then. But the hazards remain, and military analysts say that in some ways, the dangers today are greater than ever. The Strategic Air Command experienced the greatest number of broken arrows. More than the Navy or land-based missile forces, SAC deployed a greater number of weapons more widely over a longer period of time. But accidents have stalked America's land-based missile forces, too.
And the cause of the leak at the Titan II missile site
refused to confirm or deny the presence of a nuclear weapon.
And evacuation centers were set up monitoring the air for radiation.
Smell it and breathe it, and it was burning my lungs.
A Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile silo near Damascus, Arkansas. Disaster strikes in 1980, only 4 years before the system would be withdrawn from service, replaced by the Minuteman.
Flame shot into the air hundreds of feet. Then a huge glowing orange cloud formed. Putting on their gas masks, other officers began yelling, "Evacuate, clear the area."
The explosion and fire was caused by a workman accidentally dropping a socket wrench. The tool punctured a fuel cell. 8 hours later, fumes and fuel ignited. A technician trying to contain the damage was killed.
There was no radiation present. Then in the afternoon, we allowed the people to return to the area except for a roughly 1,000-foot cordon around the site.
The blast blew off the silo's 740-ton door and hurled the missile's 9-megaton nuclear warhead hundreds of yards.
It's laying in a ditch beside, it's not even up close.
it blew it out, and it's laying in the ditch. It's all exposed, and so all we need to do is go and get it.
Later reports confirmed there had been radioactive contamination at the scene.
If you have a reading of 0.5, you'll have to turn back, sir. That's affirmative.
The Titan missile system won glory in its role putting Gemini space capsules into Earth's orbit. But their nuclear warfare variants had troubled histories. The later version, the Titan II, was improved, but still subject to failure.
There have been many accidents involving Titan missiles, resulting in considerable loss of human life. And also, I have to say, a lot of accidents involving Titan missiles, which involved the possibility of accidental launch. And there was a very famous case in 1984 when two nuclear missileers in the US were going through their normal routine checks, and all of a sudden the system jumped online, and all the buttons and dials showed that the missile was about to go. Strategic Air Command, SAC, issued a statement that it was absolutely impossible for a missile to be launched in this way. But I also discovered that during this sequence, while it was going on and the missileers were unable to control it, that they took the precaution of parking an armored car on top of the silo. And that doesn't seem to me to be the decision of a group of people convinced that an accidental launch was completely impossible.
Even though broken arrows have proven unavoidable, the Pentagon has maintained the U.S. nuclear weapons forces. The military has picked up the pieces and moved on. The men of the broken arrows have done the same. Howard Richardson, who saved his crippled B-47 after dropping its bomb, went on to fly B-52s and retired as a full colonel. His co-pilot, Bob Lagerstrom, left the Air Force soon after the accident, but rejoined for 9 years before becoming a pilot for American Airlines. Clarence Stewart, whose fighter collided with the B-47, went on to F-101 and 105 aircraft and flew combat missions in Vietnam. Jim Wendorf, of the Palomares Broken Arrow, later flew B-52s over Vietnam and rose steadily in SAC command until retiring to become a building contractor. Alfred DeMario continued as flight safety officer in B-52s after the Thule accident. He retired as a lieutenant colonel and became an insurance adjuster. John Haug, who now runs a roofing business in Phoenix, flew B-52s until his retirement in 1970, but not without incident.
The first flight I flew solo as a pilot after my crash, we had smoke and fumes in the cockpit. 3 times. And the third time, I says, that's it, we're going home. And when I got back to the base and finally landed, I had a rash halfway around my body.
So far, a broken arrow has not resulted in a full-scale nuclear detonation. The U.S. military has suffered scandal, expense, and public shame, but loss of life has been limited. However, mystery haunts the subject of broken arrows. When the Russian submarine Kursk sank with all hands in the autumn of 2000, whether or not its missile bays contained nuclear warheads was a topic of heated controversy. Military analysts want to know how many accidents have occurred among the world's nuclear powers. Has the U.S. hushed up major accidents? And how often might broken arrows happen in future?
The problem is that we have no independent source of information, and that's the problem that underpins the assessment of an awful lot of the evidence to do with nuclear weapons accidents.
There was in 1980 a serious fire at the Grand Forks Air Force Base that ends up not being listed as a broken arrow because the wind was blowing away from the aircraft, and therefore the fire did not engulf the weapons involved. It was, in my judgment, perhaps the most serious nuclear accident that we had in the 1980s.
One thing is clear, the danger of these recurring, potentially disastrous accidents still exists. More and more, the military has turned to technology for a solution, only to find that machines designed to better control and safeguard the weapons have themselves proven unreliable.
Computers themselves have never actually been given control of decisions about the use of nuclear weapons, thank heavens. But computers certainly have control over warning of nuclear attack. and therefore the triggering of the response to attack. In June of 1980, there were 2 events within 3 days of each other in which suddenly the computers and the screens started again to show massive incoming Soviet missiles. And in fact, those 2 events in 1980 were traced to a single microchip with a value of 46 cents. 46 cents.
Many military analysts and some veterans of nuclear brinksmanship agree that there's only one way to ensure safety: disarmament.
Conclusion I draw is that the indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear weapons will lead to destruction of nations. And therefore we got to get rid of them. And it can be done.
The solution has to be to take forces off of alert, to take the weapons away from the delivery vehicles, to not have nuclear weapons on top of missiles that could inadvertently explode, to not have nuclear weapons next to bombers where they could be subject to a fuel fire or a crash. We've done some things to reduce the risks of accidents, but that does not mean that we've done enough.
Too many people came to understand the real risks and dangers of nuclear weapons. It might change the political climate in which nuclear weapons, by and large, are accepted by a population that largely prefers not to think about these things and to believe that somebody else is keeping them safe on their behalf.
If one's opponent doesn't have them, you don't need them. Now you say, well, what about a rogue state? We can take out the rogue state's nuclear weapons with conventional weapons. There is no military utility to them. It's immoral to think about the use. You cannot conceive of what will happen. There's no long-term solution other than their elimination. It will take decades to do that. Elimination with full verification.
More nations than ever before possess the bomb, and most of these new members of the Doomsday Club are inexperienced and enforce limited or fault-ridden safety programs. The Cold War may be over, but nuclear winter is still just one misguided conflict away.
The Indians and Pakistanis are just starting to engage in the kinds of arms race and the kind of command and control procedures that the United States and the Russians followed during the Cold War. They're going to have the same kinds of problems that we had. My own view is that nuclear deterrence and maintaining your peace by using nuclear threats is like walking across thin ice. The fact that the United States and the Russians did it once during the Cold War does not mean that we should be confident that other states can do that safely in the future.
But what are the chances of a nuclear weapon being unleashed not in war, not in the interests of victory, but inadvertently?
Inevitably, future accidents will remind the world of the continuing threat of nuclear weapons catastrophes. The veterans of Broken Arrows don't claim to have a solution, but their experiences in the depths of the Cold War are probably the best place to start looking for one.
And our young people have got to know this. It's got to be told.
It's not talked about by their parents. What happened during that era? But those things can still happen.
So this is what happens in the valley where the giant mushrooms grow.